Hello and welcome. My name is Mark Hume and you're watching the Basics of Photography Chapter 1, which is all about understanding exposure. I've been photographing for a number of years and have been lucky enough to win several awards, have a number of images published both in local and national press, so I'm here to pass on my knowledge and information gained over those years in a simple, easy to understand tutorial to help you. I've had a number of friends and colleagues come to me and say, "Well, that's a lovely photograph, I've got a camera, I've got a digital SLR, or I've got an iPhone, I've got a drone, I've got a smaller compact camera, and I just don't get those images, so why do you get those images?" And it's very simple. Most of the time people keep it on the automatic setting, which takes a lovely photograph which replicates what you're looking at, but it doesn't give you any kind of creative control of how that image looks. And what you're really trying to convey is your feeling at the time you took that photograph. For example, you might want to have some movement in the photograph, you might want to have a blurry background, and you need to understand how to take control of exposure to create them in order to come up with more creative photographs rather than just snaps, which the majority of people do. So hopefully this video in the next 5 minutes will kind of explain that to you. Photography is actually derived from the French word meaning painting with light, and the way we control images and the way it appears on that image is controlling light. There's three basic ways to do that on a camera. You can control the ISO, which stands for International Standards Organization, and ISO is basically a unit of measure that measures how much sensitivity to light the sensor has on the camera. We've also got aperture, and aperture is the kind of diaphragm, very similar to iris in your eye, that controls how kind of open or wide that is, which allows the amount of light to come in onto the sensor. And the other thing is the kind of the shutter speed, and the shutter speed controls how long the photograph has been taken for, from 1/1000th of a second to freeze that moment of time, to up to several seconds, up to minutes, which captures movement and creates blur and motion, etc. So we've talked through those three different techniques, how you change them on your camera and how you can kind of get more creative control using those. I will say in these examples I'm using a Canon, but the same kind of principle applies to Sony, any other kind of Nikon, any other make you like. The controls might be in slightly different places, but the same principle applies around how you control light on your camera. There is a direct relationship between ISO, shutter speed and aperture. They all control light, and changing one has the effect on the other. So if you don't get it right, you can have pictures too dark or too light. The basic principle around aperture is the larger the aperture, then the more light comes into the camera and the shallower depth of field you get. So you see that shallower depth of field, some people call it a bokeh or bokeh, and that's kind of where the background's all blurry, so it's a great way of isolating a subject. So for example a portrait or an insect or a flower, that type of thing, where you don't want any distractions in the background, so kind of a large aperture on that comes up with a lovely blurred background. Conversely, if you're doing landscapes, then you want a smaller aperture, and what that means is you get greater depth of field. So you might have a person standing here and a mountain in the background, and you might want the whole thing front to back sharpness, so therefore you would pick a smaller aperture. Apertures are denominated in f-stops. Sounds very technical, but if you just think of the kind of them as fractions, and the smaller the number, then the wider the aperture is. What it actually is, it's actually the measurement of the distance between the kind of blades of the lens opening and closing from the outer circumference inwards. So if it's a smaller number, then it's not as wide open, as opposed to a bigger number where there's a smaller hole. I'll give a demonstration of that here. So in this particular video we can see, just focusing on these strange weebles, which is in South Shields, we can see that selecting a large aperture has a background which is quite blurry. Then the background blur kind of decreases and becomes more and more in focus until eventually it's pretty clear front to back. I will say that the farther away the subject that you're focusing on and the background is, the more blur you get. So if you have a person standing here and the wall's pretty much behind them, then you're still going to see quite a lot of the wall. But if that wall's a good distance away, it looks a lot more blurred. And also a longer focal length zoom lens will enhance that blur even more, as opposed to a wide open lens. So shutter speed, that can be denoted by T on the Canon or S on most of the other models. So T for timeout or S for shutter speed. It both comes up with the same thing, and again you can change these in full manual mode as well. So shutter speed controls how long the kind of shutter is open, and kind of what that gives you is the ability to either freeze a moment in time or to display movement. So some examples you might want to do that on would be if you were taking, say, a sports event or an air show or that type of thing, and you've got a jet, you know, flying a good 600 knots, and you want to freeze that. You probably want a very high shutter speed of at least 1/1000th of a second, so you capture it at a moment in time. But if you want, for example, a picture of a waterfall, you might want to freeze the water, but actually it looks quite nice, and you might see in the images where you have a little bit of movement in the water. Now how much movement you want depends on how long you want that open. So half a second will create a blur, as opposed to a couple of seconds will kind of almost make it all white, and that's again the artistic effect how you want. So just have a think when you're going to take an image, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to capture a frozen moment in time, or are you trying to capture and display some kind of movement, a wave on the ocean, water running, even the blur of somebody kind of moving, that kind of effect, or long exposure of car headlights, etc. In this particular example, I just simply give you an example of where I'm running the tap in the kitchen, and just showing the example of where we're kind of freezing it at a high shutter speed, as opposed to kind of showing more motion in the water at a lower shutter speed. Obviously the impact on that is that the lower the shutter, more light comes in, and it gets to a point where your image is too bright to be able to see something. Okay, so ISO is the actual camera sensor's sensitivity to light, and that can be controlled in conjunction with the timer, in other words the shutter speed and the aperture. The kind of higher the ISO number, the more sensitive to light the camera sensor becomes. The downside of that is you get what's called noise, and noise kind of is the kind of little speckles that you see in images, although that can be controlled quite well in post-production in various bits of software such as Lightroom these days. But just bear in mind that general principle, try and keep the highest ISO you can, because the image quality is better, it's got better dynamic range and has less noise. But there will be times where you need to increase that ISO to get the picture that you need. And these examples here, I've used my good old Darth Vader model, and I have a full frame camera, so it's actually better at noise than some of the smaller kind of cameras like this one, so you won't see the noise as accentuated, but it just gives you an example, taking the exact same picture with all the other settings the same. Okay then, so in summary, what we've discussed, and I'll kind of show you this infographic which kind of explains it quite nicely, is how we control light going in the camera. There's three basic ways we do that. We can do that by controlling the shutter speed, which is the amount of time that the shutter's open. We can control the ISO, which is the camera sensor's sensitivity to light, and we can control the aperture, which is how wide the iris of the lens kind of opens to allow light in. all of those three have different effects. So controlling the aperture gives you that depth of field look. So the smaller the aperture number, f2.8, f2.3, right down to f16, kind of gives you that sharpness, either with a blurry background or right up to the kind of full depth of field that you can see on, say, a landscape picture. The shutter speed kind of captures movement or freezes it in time, so the kind of longer the shutters open, the more movement you get in the image. And the ISO increases the sensitivity to light, so the higher the ISO, the more light and lighter the picture becomes, but the downside of that, it increases the noise. So I would recommend that you get your camera, you put it on manual aperture or shutter speed, and you actually play around with these settings. You don't have to go miles. As you can see from my photos, these are kind of mostly in the house, the examples that I've shown you. You can just go and try that, and then when you go and take an image, have a think about what you're trying to show and which camera setting will best represent that. So it might be a landscape that you want lovely front to back sharpness, in which case maybe use f16, something like that. Or it's a river where you want a small bit of movement in the stream, so you want a half a second, 1 second movement in the stream. Or it could be a really dark night shot where you have to increase the ISO to bring out some of the light, because otherwise it'll be a pitch black image. So just have a bear in mind that, and I do recommend that you kind of practice until you get the hang of all the different camera settings. You're never going to learn anything if you leave it on that automatic, and I will leave it there. This video is the first in a series of videos on the basics of photography. So this one was all about kind of understanding exposure. So if you please subscribe, because my next video will all be about composition and kind of what separates your photograph from everybody else's. And thank you all, and I do hope you subscribe. I'm Mark Hume. Bye for now.